This episode is going to be fun because I feel like now, after all of the background we needed to understand the concept of the unconscious, now we get to the fun part. At least it's the fun part to me because the structure of the unconscious gives us a way to sort of organize different ways of looking at our own personality. And now that we understand the history, we come to the functional part now of how all this works. So we begin in the year 1925, the year that Carl Gustav Jung turned 50 years old. He had quite the year of travel because in January 1925, he was in New Mexico at the Taos Pueblo, where he had gone to study the dreams and mythology of the Hopi, and he met their chief called Mountain Lake, or Antonio Mirabal, who he kept a relationship through letters the rest of his life. During the summer of 1925 and all through the fall, Jung traveled to Africa. And the fun part for me is that as Jung went to Africa, traveling to Kenya and Uganda, he hit the jackpot. And I have to explain what I mean by that. He didn't know, and he could not have known, because in East Africa, Jung was at ground zero of haplogroup L3. All these years later, haplogroup L3 turns out to be the mitochondrial DNA of 90% of the people on this planet. 90% originated in the Great Rift Valley, on the plains of the Serengeti, on the shores of Lake Victoria, in Kenya and Tanzania. It's the jackpot because that's where we come from. That's where modern humans, Homo sapiens, originated. The year was somewhere within 5,000 years, between 75,000 to 70,000 BP. That means before the present, rather than using a mythological reference like BC or BCE. Haplogroup L3 originated in a very interesting time frame, and you could say somewhere within those 5,000 years, from 75 to 70,000 BP, the single most important thing that ever happened to human beings happened. So let's look at that. That time period puts us in the genetic bottleneck, as it's called. That we can tell from the genes that around that time there were very, very few Homo sapiens. One theory for the bottleneck has to do with the eruption of the supervolcano Toba in Indonesia around that time, and it caused an abrupt climate change that made it difficult for humans and plants and other species to survive. It's estimated that the bottleneck meant there were as few as 2,000 to 10,000 individual Homo sapiens left on the planet at that time. Another theory is called the long bottleneck, which posits that this happened over a longer period of time. But we know that somewhere between 75 and 70,000 BP, there were very few people left on the planet, which comes to the second thing. During this same time period, the so-called second migration out of Africa occurred. The first migration had been a while ago, about 130,000 years BP, and In the bottleneck, all of those people who had previously left in the first migration somehow were wiped out. And that's why we're descended from the people of the second migration. And it's thought that possibly as few as 1,000 individuals walked to the Arabian Peninsula, to Yemen, from Africa, from which all the rest began. And the third thing that's important has to do with the last evolutionary change to the human brain that we're aware of. Sometimes it's called the Great Leap Forward. Something changed that gave Homo sapiens a capacity they had not had before. I think it has to do with the capacity for abstraction. It's possible that didn't exist before, and maybe abstract representation. When I say representation, I mean the ability to represent something with images and symbols. That would be a great leap forward. And by talking about the Great Leap Forward and the last evolutionary change to the brain, what we really mean is that theoretically, we could swap babies to 75,000 years ago. I could take you as an infant from the arms of your mother and swap you to a new mother 75,000 years ago, and I could take her baby from her arms and bring her here to our time and our family. And both babies would thrive, each in their own cultural environment, because there are no essential differences between that time and this time, theoretically. Now, all of this about haplogroup L3 is really in the service of talking about what human beings are like. What you are like, what I am like. And previously, we've talked about two parts. We've talked about the consciousness and the unconscious, but now we come to the part we have to go a bit further and talk about the structure of the unconscious, and we need some more sophisticated models, of which the first is Freud's topographical model. So the topographical model comes in Freud about the year 1900 with the publication of his book, The Interpretation of Dreams. And he starts with a very basic thing, I think, that helps us. So he thinks of consciousness, which I would call ego consciousness. Below that, pre-consciousness, which is essentially those things of which we are capable of being conscious, and yet with the shortcomings of our attention span, we have to only keep in mind so much at one time. But the pre-conscious is all those things of which we could be conscious if we directed our attention to it. And then below that, Freud's initial idea of what he called the unconscious. And early on in 1900, for Freud, the unconscious was the repressed personal memories of things that were once in consciousness and fell out of consciousness. That's very much the idea of a basement, except the idea that the basement door is locked and all the things that don't want to be seen are hidden in the basement. They were once upstairs on the main floor. They've been now repressed, locked in the basement. And that is the content of the unconscious. That's a very, very simple view. Okay, Freud's tripartite model essentially said the unconscious consisted of things which had been previously conscious and now had fallen into the unconscious through the mechanism of repression. So in 1900 for Freud, the first part was the unconscious is the place where things are repressed by the censor to protect consciousness from disturbing thoughts. And so that's where we get the stuff that we talk about, defense mechanisms, the way in which the censor protects consciousness from disturbing thoughts, which would be, as we said, repression, projection, displacement, regression, rationalization, sublimation, reaction formation. We could talk about what all those mean, but it's again the idea that this unconscious is a place where things of which we were once conscious have now fallen into the basement. Moving forward now to 1909, when Freud and Jung had their famous trip to America, to Clark University, and they had 2 weeks on the boat together, back and forth. Jung is already starting to say to Freud that he has other ideas about the unconscious as being more than just the repository of repressed personal memory. And in particular, Jung is starting to talk about instinct. And instinct had already been brought in as a subject of psychological research by Wilhelm Wundt, and then that's another story, but briefly, that Wilhelm Wundt is considered one of the founders of psychology, one of the founders of experimental psychology, and in Leipzig, he was beginning to talk about instinct as an underlying operating system of the human species. So Freud is beginning to get this pressure about more to the unconscious than just repressed personal memory. And by 1912, Jung is writing the book that we come to call now Symbols of Transformation. In 1912, it's volume 5 in Jung, Wandlungen der Libido, which was part of the basis of his break with Freud in two ways. Jung is talking about libido in that book being more than just sexual libido for Freud. So he's breaking the sexual theory, which Freud considered absolute, and essentially proposing more of a drive theory that libido has many forms. It could be sexual, it could be kinship libido, it could be hunger, all of the what eventually became drives. And now in 1912, Jung for the first time is beginning to talk about a collective unconscious, in addition to the Freudian repressed memory unconscious, which Jung began to call the personal unconscious. So now we get a three-part division: consciousness, the personal unconscious of the repressed things from consciousness, which Jung did not dispute, and then thirdly now an instinctual or the collective unconscious. We have to stop for just a minute and say there's a way in which by now, 100 years later, the term collective unconscious has been a problematic term. It's problematic in the sense that, again, colloquially, people confuse collective consciousness with the collective unconscious as a sort of mystical union of minds. That is not at all what Jung described as the collective unconscious. And then in later years, he proposed other terms, such as the objective psyche, rather than the term collective unconscious. But in the first place, what Jung is beginning to talk about is instinct. In other words, now we're talking about nature versus nurture in a model of the unconscious. Nature versus nurture. So let's think about that for a minute. For instance, when we think of instinct, a sort of species behavior, patterns of behavior. The best example I can think of is my cats. And then we'll apply that to ourselves in a minute. But with my cats, I have two cats. We always get two cats because, they need each other. And when you go to the rescue, our particular rescue was able to tell us a story a little bit about our cats. And so when we went in, there was this one cat that they said, "This is the smartest cat we've ever had in the rescue. You have to see this cat." 9 months old. His name was Misty. And they had a room where you could take your adoptive pet to see how everybody got along. And sure enough, Misty is the smartest cat in the world. 9 months old. And they explained to us that Misty had been with the cat lady. There were 30 other cats in the house. They said that he was well fed, he was not neglected, but that there were a lot of cats and he was on his own without a lot of humans. And then to get the second cat, once we knew we had the smartest cat, we brought in a variety of cats to see who got along well with Misty. And then it turned out this other, now 5-month-old cat, Melissa, was the one who got along best with Misty. Her story, they told us, was that she was raised in a cage before she was brought to the animal rescue. She was in a cage and she was fed, she was not neglected, but that had been her life previously. So there you go. I can do a case study of the cats insofar as both of my cats have a personal unconscious and they have an instinctual unconscious. We'll get to the instinctual in a minute, but the personal unconscious is that because I know the history, I know how self-sufficient Misty is. He is perfectly fine being on his own. He is king of all that he commands, but he does have these Freudian behaviors, which are what you would call displacements. More when he was little than now, but Misty used to make what we called Misty piles. He would gather up all the toys that he liked, take them in his mouth, and hide them under the bed in a big pile, a Misty pile, and then he would sit on the pile. And to this day, if something new comes, a new toy or even new shoes, something like that, Misty will sit on it as a statement of, I own this now. To me, that neurotic cat behavior of his personal unconscious comes from the fact that when you grow up with 30 other cats around you who are all bigger than you are, you have to own what you want or someone will take it away from you. That's in his personal unconscious. Melissa is the scared cat. She was raised in a cage. She is very suspicious of all new people, all new things. And where you really see this personal unconscious coming out is, in fact, happens every day at feeding time because Misty eats very fast. He inhales his food almost without chewing because if you're growing up with 30 cats, you better eat fast or there's not going to be any food. Melissa, on the other hand, raised in a cage, eats very slowly. She's kind of picky. And so to feed the two cats together, you have to watch that Misty will finish first and will take whatever food is there. Both of those cats have a personal unconscious from their personal history. But now we come to the instinctual part. And we get to I know for a fact that my cats never observed other cats hunting. I know for a fact that, with very few exceptions, and especially when they were young cats, they never saw a mouse. And yet, you can see both cats exhibit, obviously, feline behavior. They have hunting behavior, they have exploring behavior, they're territorial behavior, and of course, they move and they act like cats. They have a feline instinct. And part of the question is, how does that happen? That a cat acts like a feline, a dog acts like a canine, and humans act like Homo sapiens. Freud's second model, now 20 years later, coming in 1920 in the book Beyond the Pleasure Principle, is called the structural model. And you can see a different arrangement that gives us more complexity, because that's the first time where he talks about the famous id, the ego, and the superego. Just historically, it's important to note all of those sort of Latin terms, ego, id, superego, were added by English translators in German when Freud is writing just for himself. The id is called the it, das Es. The ego is called das Ich, the I, and the superego called the Über-Ich. And then that structural model now gives us something else, because he gets a little more into an aspect where it's more difficult to see how much is conscious, how much is not conscious. So the ego, we're going to have to talk about the ego to get that straight. But let's say the ego is what we call executive function, decision making, the rational part of our personality, sandwiched in between two competing forces. So let's talk about the superego. It's sort of a very basic assumption, and yet I think people have trouble realizing just how dominated they can be by the superego, in the sense that the superego is the pressure to conform from society. And you would say that is external. Freud gives us a useful insight in that it is also internal, insofar as the child internalizes the views of the father and the mother. So that's social pressure, the way the father and the mother have reached an ego compromise with their own parents and society, is internalized in the child as right and wrong. What is good to do, what is bad to do, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And in that sense, then, the internal part is, even if a person escapes the outside pressure, the inside pressure to conform to the superego, thou shalt not, that's the superego, plays a large role in determining how we feel. Guilt, all of those aspects of the superego. Two competing forces, the id on the one side and the superego on the other side, in the sense that the id is now, Freud is bringing in sort of instinctual functioning. And the id includes sort of the impulses and impulsivity of childhood. You want to kill your father, you hate your newborn sibling. All of those powers come in, and then as far as the id goes, we'd have to say it's worse than that, because it includes sort of the social functioning. So let's think about Freud's idea of the id. The classic quote and definition is from a little bit later than Ego and the id. It comes in 1933, and this is his way of talking about this nature part of our unconscious, right? It is the dark, inaccessible part of our personality. What little we know of it, we have learned only from our study of the dream work and, of course, the construction of neurotic symptoms, and most of that is of a negative character and can only be described as a contrast to the ego. We approach the id with analogies. We call it chaos, a cauldron full of seething excitations. It is filled with energy reaching it from the instincts, but it has no organization, produces no collective will, but only a striving to bring about the satisfaction of the instinctual needs subject to the observance of the pleasure principle. Where id is, there shall ego be. That's the classic quote. Or a little bit more in 1940, the paper on the outline of psychoanalysis. The id contains everything that is inherited, that is present at birth, is laid down in the constitution, above all, therefore, the instincts, which originate from the somatic organization and which find a first psychical expression here in the id, in forms unknown to us. We're forming this idea, Freud is forming this idea of the dark continent of the id. And that's interesting, the dark continent, because it's also a reference to Africa. And there's a way in which we can't approach the id without the fantasy of the famous primal horde. When Freud tried to imagine what people were like without an ego and how they would live, he imagined this situation in prehistory, the dawn of humanity, in which the primal horde controlled everybody's emotions and behavior. So the famous passage in Freud about the primal horde now is in 1913 in Totem and Taboo, and sort of this is the famous piece. You probably heard this before. Freud sets up this idea of the primal horde by imagining a band, a family in prehistoric times ruled by a strong, domineering father who, of course, had all of the sexual part, the women under bondage, because that's what a primal horde is like, right? The strong man. To quote directly, this is the famous passage in Totem and Taboo from 1913. One day, the brothers who had been driven out came together, killed and devoured their father, and so made an end to the patriarchal horde. Cannibal savages as they were, it goes without saying that they devoured their victim as well as killing him. The totem meal, which is perhaps mankind's earliest festival, would thus be a repetition and a commemoration of this memorable and criminal deed, which was the beginning of so many things, of social organization, of moral restrictions, and of religion. That is Freud's picture of what primordial human beings are like, of what savages are like, and a fantasy about the killing of the primal father as the beginning of morals, social organization, and religion. Now, Freud didn't call this his fantasy of something that might have happened. For him, it was what happened. The original sin, the primary guilt of human beings, is from this act that actually happened. And there's obviously a lot that's problematic about his fantasy now being taken literally. And one of the things we have to say, because it comes into everything we want to talk about this instinctual unconscious, is that this idea that personal individual experiences can be inherited and passed on to future generations is called Lamarckism. After Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, 1744 to 1829, in which he argues that acquired characteristics within the lifetime of an individual, and his famous example was giraffes. Giraffes have long necks because the mother reaches her neck up to get the leaves, and it stretches the neck, passes to the next generation, and the child lifts his neck up, passes on to the next generation. Those are personally acquired characteristics, and it's called epigenetics, as opposed to Darwin's view of evolution. And so, I have to say, you do realize that the way we understand evolution now is that evolution proceeds through genetic changes. Your personal memories or experiences are not passed along to future generations. So to say Lamarckism is to accuse someone of an invalid view of how things are inherited and passed on, and we do have to say that both Freud and Jung have been accused of Lamarckism when they propose things like the primal father, or in Jung's case, the idea of a national unconscious, much less the really terrible idea of a racial unconscious. Those would be Lamarckian characteristics that are outside of the Darwinian model. And coming back to Darwin, we have to say this idea of the primal horde originates with Darwin himself, again, going back to when he's thinking about prehistory and what early human beings were like. So in The Descent of Man, Part 3, Sexual Selection in Relationship to Man, as in humans, from 1871, Darwin speaks of the primal horde. To quote Darwin, "Let us suppose the members of a tribe practicing some form of marriage. To spread over an unoccupied continent, they would soon split up into distinct hordes, separated from each other by various barriers, and still more effectively by the incessant wars between all barbarous nations. The hordes would thus be exposed to slightly different conditions and habits of life, and sooner or later come to differ in some small degree. Thus, the differences between tribes, at first very slight, would gradually and inevitably become more or less increased." In other words, selection, pressure, making the tribes evolve in a different way. And now we're back to prehistory and the primal horde as a barbarous nation with incessant wars. And we can push that back even farther, that we can talk about Thomas Hobbes, famous for his description of what's called, Hobbesian man, which is essentially uncivilized human beings. And again, this is the famous quote from his book Leviathan in 1651. "And which is worst of all, continual fear and the danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." That is Hobbes' fantasy of primordial man. So you could say we come across this fantasy of what life was like before civilization, the life of the instinctual human. And of course, what we're getting is what back in my old career, we would call that a negative anthropology, right? Is that it's savage, dark, the pleasure principle, and human beings without impulse control. That is the negative anthropology, the dark side. But you could also say, just while we're at it, the other side would be a positive anthropology, and we also get this idea of the noble savage. Back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the idea of natural man in his natural state. And you find that in Jung, for instance. Back to his trip in 1925 to Africa, Jung describes this experience that he has looking out over the plains of the Serengeti. To set it up, the quote here, that he is on the train and he looks up, and on the top of the hill he sees a lone figure with a spear, kind of a Maasai warrior. And then he offers this reflection. I had the feeling that I had already experienced this moment and had always known this world, which was separated from me only by distance in time. It was as if I were in this moment returning to my youth, as if I knew that dark-skinned man who had been waiting for me for 5,000 years. So there's a lot in these fantasies, whether the negative anthropology, the dark, savage, primal horde, or the positive anthropology of Rousseau, natural man in his natural state, as we all should be, and how could we ever gotten away from that? But we can actually compare these fantasies, let us say, two white guys, two Europeans, sitting around fantasizing about primordial humans. We can compare the fantasy to what we actually know about primordial human beings. This is really interesting to me when I began to think about social evolution and its relationship to symbols, because that is a part of our evolutionary history, and religion and social organization. I mean, this is kind of the stuff you heard in school, perhaps you've long forgotten, but actually it's really interesting when you stop and think about it. And so what we really mean now is the various eras of human existence, as in the Paleolithic, the Neolithic, breaking into the Bronze Age, late Bronze Age, Iron Age, and then sort of bleeding into what we call the Dark Ages, not really so dark, medieval times, the Renaissance, pre-industrial, industrial society, and post-industrial society. All of those things are in our unconscious. That's what I want to get to, sort of about what this psychology of the unconscious in Freud and Jung is addressing when it talks about instinctual urges. So we have to learn about the Paleolithic and how that is structured going into the Neolithic, and how that is structured, and the Bronze and Iron Age, and what changed. So let's talk about that. I want you to imagine a valley with hills around, like the plains of the Serengeti or some other aspect, without a trace of human beings. Except now in this landscape of hill and valley, in the dry season, there's a road, which is our timeline, just the dirt road. in our fantasy, just to illustrate these different periods of human development, we're going to say that the road is 10 miles long. And where we're standing now, our perspective looking at the road and the valley and the hills is the present, now. And then as we look way, way, way to the horizon, where the road fades around the side of the hill, we're going to start there. We're going to call it 75,000 years ago. So this is going to be the late Paleolithic time, 75,000 years ago. When you imagine that, what you get is that from 75,000 years ago to now in the present, 84% of that time was lived in the late Paleolithic era. 84%, which on our time scale would be 8.5 miles of our 10-mile journey is Paleolithic. And when we talk about the different ages, I think it's very helpful. I think of them as actually different lifestyles, so that the Paleolithic is the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And in the Paleolithic, human beings lived in the original human situation, which is the band of human beings. Hunter-gatherer bands. That is the lifestyle. Now, as we go through the ages, it's also important to remember that each of the lifestyles we're going to encounter in each of the ages still continues to this day. You could say, yes, of course, we still discover human bands living on islands in the jungles with a hunter-gatherer Paleolithic lifestyle. But you could say that aspect of living is still in my life, still in your life. We have our band. We have our bubble, that group of people who is closest to us. And the Paleolithic band is a group of human beings of somewhere between 20 and 50 individuals. I've always called it 2 families plus hangers-on make a band. And we say that because the 2 families plus the hangers-on stragglers that are then accepted into the band create just enough genetic diversity that a band of human beings can continue for hundreds and hundreds of years in a hunter-gatherer society. So that's 84%, about 8.5 miles of our journey. Next, we move to the Great Revolution, which is called the Neolithic Revolution, which is now, we're coming into 12,000 years before the present. The Neolithic Revolution is the domestication of plants and animals. I should mention that this concept of the Paleolithic, Neolithic, the lithic part, lithic, lith means, of course, stone in Greek. The Stone Age, this concept of the Stone Age goes back to John Lubbock in England. And in 1865, he published a very influential book called Prehistoric Times, in which he talked about the Stone Age, and he invented the terms Paleolithic, Neolithic as the Old Stone Age, New Stone Age. And to talk about the Stone Age means that archaeologically, we're talking about our archaeologists, paleontologists are able to dig up stone artifacts. That's what the Stone Age refers to, stone artifacts, which in this case is essentially flint, because flint was worked into tools that could be used. And then occasionally the most fantastic stone you could find, which was obsidian, which is essentially volcanic glass. We know that there were extensive trading networks for obsidian, which made better knives, better arrowheads, and that's the Stone Age. And as we start to talk about the change from one age to another, you have to remember that this discovery and adoption of a new lifestyle among human beings is a process. It wasn't that there was a bright line across history and people said, oh, now we're going to live in the Neolithic era. It's a process, and in different places took different amounts of time, but the general date given for the Neolithic revolution of the domestication of animals and plants is 12,000 years ago. About that time, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle changed to the possibility of a more settled existence. So if we think of Paleolithic people as living in human bands, we think of Neolithic people as living in villages. And that domestication means that if it's plants and crops, it's a village. If it's herding of animals that are domesticated, then it can be a nomadic tribe. It's not exactly a village. So the concept of tribe is by definition a Neolithic concept. A tribe is a conglomeration of bands, and you see that in tribes with the different clans. The clans are the old memory of how bands came together to make larger organizations. And I should say that in my own research, my hypothesis is that I think of each age as having to do with the carrying capacity, as it's called, of the environment, which is essentially how many people can live in the same place at the same time and still have enough food to eat. With a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, you can't have too many people in the same place at the same time because there are not that many berries and there's not that much game for a large group of people. Smaller groups of people, as I said, up 20 to 50 can live within a region and sustain demand by hunting and gathering. So the Neolithic revolution, because you're domesticating plants and growing your own crops, now you have a situation where 200 or so people can live in the same place at the same time. It's an exponential growth from the 20 to 50 of the band. The 200, let's say, to 500 of the village can live in the same place at the same time. So back to the idea of on our journey, that means that the Neolithic revolution is only 1.5 miles from where we are today compared to our 10 miles. Because really now you have to move to about 5,500 years ago to the next revolution, which is called the Bronze Age Revolution, 5,500 years ago, in the ancient Near East. In other words, what we call ancient Sumer was the beginning of the first city. And the revolution is essentially metallurgy. We move now from stone tools and implements that archaeologists can find to the first metal, metallurgy, and the secrets of metallurgy. And the lifestyle now shifts population density to the city. The first cities on the face of the planet are dependent on this Bronze Age revolution, in which now you have cities in which 10,000 people can live in the same place at the same time. This concept of carrying capacity means that a city is by definition not self-sufficient. The carrying capacity requires the vassal states to send in supplies, food, to resupply the city every 5 days. The hunter-gatherer band is self-sufficient. A village is self-sufficient, but a city requires a much larger environment to meet its carrying capacity. Until now, we can jump ahead to the Iron Age, 3,200 years ago, and in general, you can think of ancient Rome as being the Iron Age city. And in the Iron Age city now, Rome, the first city of 1 million people, a megalopolis, as it's called, has a carrying capacity that requires the entire Mediterranean basin to supply the city for 1 million people to live in the same place at the same time. So back to our timeline, what we have is that the Iron Age at 3,200 years ago is only 4.2% of human time since 75,000 years ago. And on our map, it's hard to start to put on even the birth of the Iron Age because it works out to being 580 yards from here to ancient Rome. And then finally to come to the Industrial Age, only 250 years ago. We have a hard time even putting that on our map because that is going to represent only 1/3 of 1% of human history since 75,000 years ago. And on our map, that works out to about 6 yards, 6 steps. This Industrial Age, again, with megalopolis, the first city of 10 million people, New York, soon followed by London, that requires the entire world trade, industrialized trade, to supply the city. In what I'm trying to say, it's important to remember that each of these different ages, from the Paleolithic to the Industrial Age, represent a different psychological need. That the tool set you need to live in each of these lifestyles is different and represents a development of the unconscious. And those different tools would be an aspect of what Freud calls the superego, and Jung eventually comes to call the cultural unconscious, which is a way of saying how society pressures us to conform. Now, in dealing with Freud's structural model of an id, superego, and ego, I have to say perhaps that for some people this is really very simple, and that you know sort of what is coming later, which is that Jung develops a much more robust picture of the structure of the unconscious. But I just ask you to be patient because we have to have the background before we get to something more complicated and descriptive. But it does put us at the point now of being able to really think about the fantasy of the primal horde, which is the id. And this fantasy of Freud, of Darwin, of the negative anthropology, we have to ask, was it really that way? Is that what the childhood of humanity looks like? Was it really, as Hobbes said, nasty, brutish, and short? Because we actually know a thing or two about living in a hunter-gatherer society. And the picture that we get there is a very different picture than this, shall we say, projection of Freud onto the childhood of humanity. And in fact, the entire enterprise of trying to combine the instinctual urges of children with early humans, one would have to say, is essentially racist and colonialist. That it is a projection of Freud's imagination of what life outside of an industrialized society would be like. When in fact that we know from hunter-gatherer societies, it's not like the fantasy at all. We know that hunter-gatherer societies are egalitarian, and what that means is that the wealth distribution is almost non-existent. Everyone is sort of at the same economic level because, when you are nomadic hunter-gatherers, you carry everything you need on your back, and there's only space for survival. It's also egalitarian in the sense that we also know that men and women can both take leadership. There is some sexual division of labor insofar as the men tend to be hunters, the women tend to do the gathering, but that is not absolute. Women go to hunt, men participate in gathering. And then we also know that the human qualities of cooperation, sharing, altruism must have had an evolutionary advantage in contributing to the survival of human beings. So all of those traits speak now to our own nature. In terms of Hobbes' thought about being brutish, and I suppose when he says brutish, we have to think that he means violence. We have to ask the question, is a hunter-gatherer society any more violent than an industrial society like our own? And, I do have to say, I remember the story from Malinowski, the preeminent anthropologist, in his work with the Trobender Islanders in Papua New Guinea, when he was investigating the sexual practices of the local people. And you'd have to say they're not really living paleolithic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. They're already have farming and is more of a Neolithic lifestyle. There's this story that I remember where he's interviewing a woman about her life, and he asks her, how did you meet your husband? And she says, no, he's not my husband. He killed my husband. And Malinowski, being kind of shocked, says, this man killed your first husband? And she says, oh no, he is not my first husband. And Malinowski says, what happened to your first husband? And she said, oh, he was killed by my second husband. That's how I became his. Now, you have to say that that's a story about this woman normalizing sexual violence. And it helps us get to this question about, okay, is a non-industrial society more prone to sexual violence than an industrialized society? And it's not. Sexual violence is as prominent today in our society as it has been back to 75,000 years ago. So this whole idea of the violence of the primal horde is a bit ironic for Freud to be so fearful of the violence in the id, writing in 1913, when in 1914, the greatest violence the world has ever known broke out in Europe. And you would have to say the violence was not sublimated violence, it was industrialized violence, which killed millions and millions on a scale that Paleolithic hunter-gatherers could not have imagined. And you'd have to say industrialized society is the most violent society in history. So, what we're really coming down to is this question of our own nature in the nature versus nurture debate. And I hope that we've learned a few things about our nature and what is the nurture part. Because what we're saying is that our nature, as in the genetic changes in human beings through evolution, would go back to a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. So whatever we want to say about our nature, whether it's a dark anthropology or a positive anthropology, or a more realistic picture of both things at the same time, all of that is coming from the Paleolithic hunter-gatherer lifestyle. All the rest now, it's not genetic, it's not evolution, but is cultural. So that takes us, that's why we went through the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and into our own industrial age. And that part of nurture would be what Freud called the superego, and Jung begins to talk about as the cultural unconscious, shaping us through nurture. Okay. Our nature, then, in Freud's imagination, in this structure of the id, the superego, and the ego, is, in his fantasy, dark, fulfilling the pleasure principle, violent, savage. And we've seen how much of that is a projection, but there's also no getting around the fact that is that in you? Is that in me? Am I capable of being violent? Am I lacking in impulse control? Am I driven by sexual urges and all of the other sort of drives or instinctual functioning that we could point to? And the answer is yes. That is a part of my unconscious, a part of your unconscious. And so in this episode now, we have opened the unconscious, at least to this other level where we talk about something that is inherently human below the surface of the cultural superego. And to give Freud his due, you have to at least say he's asking the question. He is confronting Viennese society with these aspects of human nature that are being held down with industrial strength steel in the superego to crush children to be civilized, and saying that that is failing. And beyond that, Freud builds into the nature of psychoanalysis this critique of industrialized culture. Freud then, with Jung, is the very first to, what we would say nowadays, state that for more than 85% of human history, we lived in a hunter-gatherer culture with very small groups of people. In industrialized society, all of that is shut down, and that makes us neurotic. That makes us sick. That's the critique of psychoanalysis. That has to do with all of the ages and our own nature versus nurture. So the question becomes, what are we going to do about it? And not to put too fine a point on it, but the greed and lack of impulse control of the industrialized age is destroying the planet. And as I said once in a lecture I was asked to give on the shadow side of science, that you do have to remember that we, Homo sapiens, are just big apes with big guns. And what do you think is going to happen? Welcome to being a psychoanalyst, because there are no easy answers. And even the question of what to do about the id or these aspects of the unconscious is a question from the superego. To do something, what is there to do? We have our environment of evolutionary adaptedness 75,000 years ago, and the fitness that evolved, our fitness, was for that environment. And we don't live in that environment anymore. And how are we going to find our fitness to live in the reality of what we have to face now? But I can close with saying that Freud offered that our only hope is the reality principle, to face the truth. And, people say that psychoanalysts are glum because we have to deal with the reality, we have to deal with the truth of a person in their life. And I don't know if I strike you as particularly glum, but I can say that the truth is sometimes very interesting. And that's what I want to talk about.